for the next hour. After he talks for a while, we're gonna have a Q&A. We're gonna limit the Q&A to the chat. We're just gonna experiment with that this time. So before I share my screen, I think we're going to turn off the chat while he's speaking. Turn off the chat while he's speaking. Why is that talking back to me? Okay. Hold on just one sec, okay?
Somebody's got two devices. We have to figure out who it is.
Oh, is that why?
Yeah.
Hold on just one sec, okay?
Somebody's got two devices. We have to figure out who it is.
Oh, is that why? Cole, can you figure out, I don't have the option to limit the chat. Can you figure that out? The settings have changed on that.
I will try. I will have to look for that setting.
Okay. So let me introduce Jehad. I'm going to share my screen. So Jehad is the executive director of the Jerusalem Fund and also heads its educational program, the Palestine Center. He was previously the education and policy coordinator at AFSC, which is how some people here know him in Boston, and some of his colleagues are here on the call, Nancy Murray and Joe Gerson, so welcome to them. And Jehad, I wasn't clear if you're a candidate or if you have gotten your PhD.
Every time I try to get it, a war starts. But I'm almost there.
I see. All right. Well, we wish you luck in finishing it, and we also hope that the wars stop. I mean, we're working on that piece. So I wanted to share a few things. So this is from the website, the Jerusalem Fund, and as you can see, hold on a second, that they're educating people in the United States about Palestine and supporting communities in Palestine. So there's a few things in their mission. This is about the Palestine Center. And you can see that it's what it says there, communicating about the Palestinian political experience to American policymakers, journalists, students, and the general public. And so he's here today to share his experience and his wisdom about the Palestinian political experience and what's going on in Palestine. He's the editor of this book, Light in Gaza, which is an anthology. I love the description that it imagines what the future of Gaza could be while reaffirming the critical role of Gaza in Palestinian identity, history, and the struggle for liberation. And I wanted to show you a few slides. So I follow Jehad on Twitter, and I grabbed a few of the images that he posted. So this is about the Gaza International Airport. I didn't know they had an airport, and unfortunately, Israel destroyed the airport in 2001. And they also had a train station. So I love these old photos, right? And then Jehad, it looks like they destroyed it in 1967. Is that right?
Yes, immediately after Israel occupied Gaza, they destroyed the train station.
Yeah, terrible.
I can talk more about that later.
Yeah, great.
It's
And
relevant.
then, sorry.
No, I wanted to say that this story is relevant to today's talk, so
And then lastly was this, the Pasha Palace Museum, which Elias Khoury posted, but Jehad sort of posted, supported this tweet. I just found it interesting. It contains hundreds of rare artifacts and the Canaanite goddess Anat. So hopefully you've seen that. I'm going to stop my share. And the topic for today is the ongoing Nakba, 75 years of the lack of accountability. So with that, would you all please welcome Jehad? Welcome, Jehad.
Welcome.
Thank you so much, Abby, for this kind introduction. And thank you, Massachusetts Peace Action, for hosting me tonight. I used to live in Massachusetts, and I was telling my colleagues here on the call, I was talking about how much we miss it, and hopefully one day we'll visit and go back to this to Cambridge and Boston and reconnect with all the great people who I had the honor of working with and learning from during my brief time there. And talking about Gaza and the Nakba is something that I have been doing for years. So this topic is not new for me. And in light of what's happening now on the ground, in terms of what we're witnessing, in terms of the scale of destruction and killing, thinking about Gaza and about every aspect of the Palestinian experience, not just when it comes to Gaza, whether it's in the West Bank or inside the Green Line, or the experience of the Palestinian diaspora. The Nakba is an important notion or an important it helps with framing and understanding the Palestinian experience and how we ended up where we are today. And this is what I'm going to talk about briefly. I'm going to address some historical examples, but not necessarily give a history lecture, but try to ground the different ways we talk and think about Gaza in the Nakba and address this issue and talk about some of the things that Abby shared in the presentation. So I grew up in the Gaza Strip. It's where I spent most of my life. My family is from a city called Deir al-Balah, which is located in the central area of the Gaza Strip. And living in Gaza for more than 20 years, I traveled Gaza from north to south, east to west. It's a very small, the Gaza Strip is a very small territory, almost the size of, Washington, D.C. or metropolitan Detroit. The total area of the Gaza Strip in square miles is 140. So we're talking about a very tiny territory. The Gaza Strip constitutes nearly 1% of the total area of historic Palestine. That is the territory located between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, which includes what is today the State of Israel, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. So the Gaza Strip is just 1% of this entire territory that spans from Ras al-Naqura in the north on the Lebanese border down to Eilat in the south on the Gulf of Aqaba. But the Gaza Strip, despite being 1%, representing 1% of the total area of historic Palestine in terms of territory, it holds much bigger weight in terms of its place in the broader history of the Palestinian struggle for liberation and the Palestinian plight as a result of settler colonialism, decades of settler colonialism, and the ongoing Nakba. And what we are witnessing today and might be unprecedented in terms of its scale. I will give some up-to-date numbers shortly, but it's not new or different in terms of the cycles that Gaza experienced throughout its history. Like the rest of Palestinian communities and cities and villages that have been subject to this ongoing process of ethnic cleansing, erasure, and unending war on Palestinian existence on the land. So let me just provide some numbers to update you on the scale of what's happening on the ground, and then I will revisit some of the historical context, talk about the framing, and then give the audience the opportunity to ask questions. So according to Euromed Monitor, we're now talking about more than 30,000 dead or people who are reported missing or dead or buried under the rubble. So the official number is around 25,000. Those are the cases that have been reported. Those are bodies of people that made it to whatever health facilities that are still functioning on the ground. But there are thousands more who are buried under the rubble. And there are entire families that have been killed to the extent, or annihilated to the extent, that probably nobody is left alive to report on the death of relatives or family members. We're talking about 64,000 people injured, 120 journalists have been killed, and at this point, 2 million people in Gaza out of 2,300,000 or 200,000 are displaced. They don't live in their homes anymore. And when it comes to the homes, recent reports, but are not, finalized, have reported that nearly 75,000 residential units, could be homes, apartments, have been completely destroyed. So we're talking more than 75,000 homes. Think about how many extended families live in these homes. These are all gone. In addition, of course, to nearly 200,000 partially destroyed homes that most likely will be beyond repair by the end of this war, if it has an end. And of course, in the past 4 months, 200 heritage sites have been destroyed by Israeli bombardment, including Gaza's Great Umari Mosque, which is the second oldest mosque in Palestine after Al-Aqsa Mosque, and a mosque that is a witness to Gaza's long history. It stands on the ruins of an ancient Byzantine church, and before that, an ancient Philistine temple. Layers and layers of history. The Umari Mosque was completely destroyed. In addition, of course, to the Pasha Palace, which Abby showed in the slides, and referring to Ilyas Khouri's tweet. But this wasn't the first time the Umari Mosque gets destroyed in the past 120 years. In fact, the Umari Mosque was also completely destroyed during the First World War. And this is where Gaza's story in the modern era, the plight of Palestinians in Gaza, like the rest of Palestinians elsewhere, but especially in Gaza, begins. The British forces begin to arrive on the outskirts of Palestine, which was under Ottoman rule during the First World War. And the first city the British wanted to capture was Gaza City. And in order to do that, the British bombed the city from March 1917 until late October, early November 1917. So by the end of World War I, the entire city of Gaza, the ancient city of Gaza, the old city of Gaza was completely destroyed, with its bazaars and souks and alleys and mosques and churches. Most of the city was destroyed by British bombardment, and also due to the fighting between the Ottomans and the British. After Gaza fell to British conquerors, immediately days after Gaza's occupation by the British, the infamous Balfour Declaration was issued. So there is this, for Palestinians, there is this ominous memory when it comes to Gaza's, destruction, that we don't know where this moment that we're currently in will lead, but we know that in 1917, after Gaza fell to British conquest. The Balfour Declaration was issued, and for those who are not familiar with it, I'm sure most of the audience are. The Balfour Declaration set in stone or put in motion the process through which the erasure of Palestinian political rights and the Palestinian connection to the land would begin in favor of an exclusivist project, that is the Zionist project, that led to the establishment of the State of Israel. Fast forward, under the British mandate, the city of Gaza and the surrounding villages in what was called the Gaza district, due to how far they were from the centers of development under British mandate, which were mostly concentrated in the north, and also the centers of economic activity, which happened to be in close proximity to the Zionist Jewish settlements that thrived under the mandate. Gaza and the Gaza district was marginalized economically and in terms of infrastructure and access to resources. And that created in Gaza a mood of resentment against the British. And during the 1936 revolt in Gaza, Palestinians there played an important role in the revolt against the British, and challenging and defying British colonial rule. And fast forward to 1948, when the Zionist conquest of Palestinian land took its militant, aggressive shape in the form of the Nakba that we commemorate every year. That is the destruction of more than 500 Palestinian cities, towns, and villages. More than 200,000 Palestinian refugees end up pushed towards the southwestern part of Palestine, towards Gaza City and the surrounding area. And while Gaza City survives the Nakba, meaning that it wasn't conquered by Zionist militias or the nascent Israeli military in 1948, most of the territory of the Gaza district, which was one of the largest administrative districts in British Mandate Palestine, and before that in Ottoman Palestine, was reduced to what we call today the Gaza Strip. And that meant that the Gaza district, as an administrative unit that existed before 1948, before the establishment of the State of Israel, lost around 53, 54 cities, towns, and villages, from which people were expelled towards the region that would become called the Gaza Strip. So before 1948, there was no such a thing as the Gaza Strip as a territory. There was, before 48, there was a Gaza district, which was one of many districts that were borderless, just administrative, that formed what was British Mandate Palestine, and before that, Ottoman Palestine. And 1948 is very important for Gaza, because it was the moment this new territory called the Gaza Strip was born. It was born as a product of a man-made situation, a war of conquest, and that resulted in the expulsion and the relocation and the removal of hundreds of thousands of people. So today, when we, hear about refugees in Gaza, those are not refugees who came from thousands of miles away to the Gaza Strip. We are talking about people who live in one of 8 refugee camps in the Gaza Strip, whether in Shati or Jabalia or Al-Maghazi or Al-Brej or in Sirat. Those people, their grandparents and their parents, were expelled from villages that are just within walking distance from the border fence that separates what is today the Gaza Strip from what is today the State of Israel. And in fact, there are people in Gaza who could see what their former city, town, or village with their own eyes from the rooftop of their homes. So, every night they would go to the balcony or to the rooftop and they would look and they would see what was a few decades ago their village or town or the city where their ancestors lived for hundreds of years, where they own land, where they own property, and from where they were displaced in 1948 and pushed towards the area that becomes the Gaza Strip, to where they become refugees and dwell in refugee camps. And for Palestinians in Gaza, and I'm glad to expand on this point in the Q&A section, for Palestinians in Gaza and elsewhere during 1948, seeking refuge from an area where there is combat or fighting or conquest to another area that feels safer was not something new. I mean, as I said, during the First World War, the city of Gaza was destroyed, but after the war ended, the residents of Gaza were able to go back. And that's why in 48, as the fighting was taking place in historic Palestine, refugees thought that they would be able to go back after the fighting is over. However, for hundreds of thousands of refugees who ended up in Gaza, that wasn't possible. Those refugees became trapped in this new territory that was called the Gaza Strip. So what happened after 1948 to those refugees? For those of you who are interested in learning more about the experience of refugees in Gaza, I can recommend many sources that can help you understand and comprehend the scale of the humanitarian disaster that these people suffered from. But throughout the 1950s, the refugee camps were not equipped to accommodate hundreds of thousands of people who were just removed from their land and ended up in Gaza City or in the surrounding areas within the Gaza Strip and became refugees. And those people, they did not only lost their town or village or home, they also lost their source of livelihood, because most large numbers of those refugees who were expelled in 48, these were farmers and peasants who for centuries lived in semi-self-sufficient villages that and they relied on raising cattle and on planting crops, and their situation wasn't perfect, but they still lived and survived and maintained a lifestyle that survived for centuries and had culture and had a spiritual connection to the lands where they lived, since their ancestors were buried there, and so on and so forth. So in the 1950s, people in Gaza, refugees, and those who are also from the cities, towns, and villages that are within the Gaza Strip begin to grapple with the scale of the loss of 1948. But also in the 1950s, as people grappled with loss, they also claimed their agency and wanted to assert their right in what was in reclaiming what was taken from them. So we see in the 1950s a movement called the Fidaiyin movement. So it was a movement of fighters who were crossing the frontier that would become later the border fence, dividing the Gaza Strip, separating it from what is today Israel, and either launching attacks on Israeli settlements and kibbutzim that were planted in the vicinity of the Gaza Strip, or basically trying to individuals crossing, trying to reclaim land or harvest their fields or get back their property or jewelry or whatever. And in that moment, in the 1950s, the frontier dividing the Gaza Strip from the state of Israel becomes an area of friction between those refugees who wanted to go home and the Israeli state and Israeli settlers who wanted to make sure that that the lines are drawn in blood and that no Palestinian would dream of ever being able to go back to their town, city, or village. On the legal front, the Israeli Knesset passes a number of laws, including the present absentee property law, which allowed Israel to take over people's property. And of course, Israel passed an infiltration law that deems any attempt by anybody who is not allowed to enter legally to be considered an infiltrator, and infiltration then becomes an offense that was punishable with high degrees of violence, and there were many recorded cases, even reported by Benny Morris in his book on what he called the border wars, that show that Palestinians who tried to cross from Gaza to Israel, or from the West Bank to Israel, or from neighboring Arab countries, they were punished by death. They found mines in their way, and there were also many reported cases of rape that even Ben Gurion himself discusses in his diaries, and talks about in detail, in graphic detail in his diaries, talking about how the soldiers of the Israeli military were doing too much rape of Palestinian women and shepherds and farmers who ended up crossing the border fence. So this friction around the Gaza frontier is not new, and it dates back to that moment. And fast forward to 1967, when Israel occupies Gaza and imposes its military rule there. Israel does to the Gaza Strip what Israel did to the entirety of historic Palestine. And by that, I mean, remember in the beginning, I said that the Gaza Strip represents only 1% of the total area of the land between the river and the sea. So what did Israel do after it occupied Gaza in 1967 following the Six-Day War? The first thing Israel did, one of the first things Israel did, was to take over nearly one third of the area of the Gaza Strip that represents only 1% of the area of historic Palestine, and start a settlement project in Gaza, inside the Gaza Strip, competing with hundreds of thousands of refugees and hundreds of thousands of native Gazans on very precious and scarce resources such as land and fresh water, and take over most of Gaza's arable land. So that by 2005, there were 8,000 Israeli Jewish settlers living on nearly one third of the area of the Gaza Strip, alongside 1.6 million Palestinians living on the remaining area. So when Israel supporters today come out and say, look, Palestinians, how generous we are, how great Israel is, we withdrew the settlements from Gaza, which was a process of redeployment of resources dedicated to the settlement project in the West Bank. So they come out and say, and we gave you the settlements in Gaza, we withdrew from them. And by the time the Israeli settlements and settlers left Gaza, most of those areas were completely exploited by the settlers for their agricultural projects, and so on and so forth. And then fast forward, under Israeli military rule, after Israel occupies Gaza, imposes a military rule, cracks down on any form of resistance or national representation of Palestinians, cracks down on Palestinian national symbols and national figures, and expects that nothing will happen. But then 20 years later, Palestinians in Gaza rise up in what we all know as the First Intifada. And then after that, we go through the Oslo process, and with all of its hopes and delusions, which ends in the Second Intifada, which opens then a new era of events that I can't fully address in this brief talk. But the point here is not to give a history lesson. And while history is relevant to what's happening, the point of all of these examples and all of these moments that I have been addressing is to establish that we are dealing with a dynamic that has been repeating itself and reproducing itself due to a very simple fact and a reality that is very easy to understand and comprehend. There is a settler colonial project that denies the existence and rights of a population, and that's invested in the process of building a state that's exclusivist and does everything in its ability to ensure that there is a certain demographic composition and a geographic reality, and uses violence to impose this reality. So every aspect of Gaza's history, and by extension, every aspect of Palestinian history, and all these moments of pain and struggle and suffering, regardless of their scale, whether it's a brief moment of escalation that spans over 2 or 3 days, or a genocidal war that has been going on for more than 100 days, taking the lives of tens of thousands of people and displacing millions, we are still talking about the same pattern that keeps repeating itself. And what needs to be disrupted is this pattern. What needs to be stopped is this cycle. And that's why all the superficial attempts to address what people call the conflict have failed. And that's why all the initiatives that don't seriously take the process that has unfolded since 1948 and the kind of dynamics it created on the ground and set in motion have also failed, because we need to talk about the impulse of the Zionist project and the State of Israel to uproot Palestinians, remove them from their land, deny their rights, and limit privileges in one population at the expense of another. I'll stop here, and I'll be more than happy to answer any questions the audience may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Jehad. I thought that was a superb history lesson in just 30 minutes. I just thought it was great. Thank you so much. Many of us haven't heard that entire history, so thank you for providing that context. By the way, I'm sure you're familiar with Moshe Dayan's famous quote when he was standing, right? And he said, well, we can fully understand their anger because they're over there watching us work the lands that belong to them. Yeah.
Yes, I guess he had more courage than contemporary Zionists who won't dare to say something like that.
Yeah, well, despite that, they continued, excluding the Palestinians and not allowing them back on their land. Joe Gerson, as a former colleague of Jehad, I just wonder whether you would like to ask him a question.
Jehad, I'm most of this history is what I know. I found myself again and again going back to something Yasser Arafat said when we interviewed him in 1981. He said it's cowboys and Indians all over again, and it is. I think we need to appreciate. Unfortunately, I'm Jewish, but I think we have to face the reality of the profound racism that Israelis brought with them from Europe and from Russia and the Soviet Union. I mean, I've just published an article in which I say, one of the terrible ironies here is that Israel was left holding the European colonial and racist bag, but the 21st century is not the 18th or the 19th. Maybe just say one more thing and then ask you to comment on it. I mean, what we're witnessing is something not unlike watching the Warsaw Ghetto and the Warsaw Ghetto uprising in real time. And I think, um, I think what we have to engage is not only the history, but just the massive, massive murder that's part of the genocide, more than numbers, right? I mean, only better than anybody else here what that means in terms of human lives and family. But maybe if you could speak a little bit more in terms of your sense of how this fits actually into. I mean, the question is really the survival of the Palestinian people in some very real ways, and which is why we talk in terms of genocide. And I just wonder if you would kind of elaborate on that a little bit.
Of course, and I, I think one needs to zoom out a little bit, although I don't know how one could zoom out from an event that we're witnessing unfold in front of our eyes in this scale. But zoom out and look at Israel's different practices throughout the decades as different recipes for how they imagined they could deal with the Palestinians. So on one hand, there is a carrot and stick approach. If we could use this metaphor to describe how Gaza has been treated vis-a-vis, the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, showing, giving an example of incentivizing Palestinians to follow the path of the PA, for example, the use of violence, sometimes excessive, sometimes regulated, and a continuous impulse to feel that the Israeli state wanted to feel that it's in control and that it's in charge. And I think the levels of killing and destruction that we're seeing in Gaza stem from a sense of insecurity and an extreme desire for revenge by the Israeli military and intelligence establishments after they realized that all their theories and all their recipes and all their ideas about how to contain the Palestinians and manage the Palestinians and play this game of one time calculating calories, mowing the lawn every 2 or 3 years, assassinating a leader here or a leader there, realizing that at some point they might not be in control. Their intelligence will fail them. Their military capabilities would prove weak in the face of certain events and certain actors who take the time to plan and devise whatever actions they plan and devise. So I think there is an element, like a psychological element of shock and a psychological reaction that we thought we could control you. We thought we could live our lives in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, play the, high-tech country that's LGBTQ friendly and has sidewalks painted with the rainbow colors, and talk about Israel's and conquer the culinary world with Israel's hummus and claiming falafel and bring in artists. And at the same time, you miserable Palestinians dwell silently in your refugee camps forever. And if you ever say anything, we'll mow the lawn. But they did not expect an explosion coming from Gaza in that scale and intensity. And that's why they don't feel in charge anymore. And that's why the alternative of not being able to control you all is we will kill you all, and we will displace you all, and we will destroy an entire city with all of its universities and hospitals and neighborhoods and ancient buildings that go back to 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. We will destroy Byzantine churches and ancient mosques and ancient harbors and kill 30,000 people and basically remove Gaza, end it. And that's what happens when a nation frames its survival as something that's contingent of the misery of others. And I also think there is also a racist element in the sense that, if you think about it philosophically, I mean, how dare you rebel? You are meant to live a certain lifestyle, you Palestinians. You belong in the refugee camp where the population density could reach 10 or 12,000 people in a square kilometer, living by the sewage, by the garbage, suffering from malnutrition. And if you dare to ask for something else, we'll crush you. So I think there is something deeply troublesome about this reaction.
Yeah. Thank you, Jehad. So, Cole, can you open the comments for people? We're going to take your questions from the chat box. So be thinking of your question and type it in the chat box. Julie, in a second, I'm going to ask you to choose the first one. And to Joe's point, Jehad, Masha Gessen, as I'm sure you know, made the comparison, the analogy to the Warsaw Ghetto, which sounded right to most of us. And they said what Israel is doing was at the very least a liquidation of the ghetto. Of course, they're pulverizing and destroying the Gaza Strip entirely, right? Yep. Julie, you want to give us a question?
Well, first of all, I want to say shukran to you, Jehad. أنا بكلم شوية عربي. And I wish for you, your family, all of Palestine, peace and freedom.
Thank you so much.
I'm not seeing any questions in the chat box right now.
Jeffrey, we're not going to take verbal questions. Can you type your question in the chat box? That would be very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, I have one now. Thank you. Thank you for that excellent talk. I have 48 questions, just one. What are your thoughts on the other side of the war? Hope?
I'm assuming my thoughts on the Israeli side of the war.
Susie, it's not clear. Why don't you, we're going to take Skip's question. Susie, why don't you explain what you mean about the other side of the war? Julie,
I just mean hope, I just feel hopeless and can you hear me? Yeah. And
Yep.
and I don't see another, like, where will Palestine when does this stop? Where will, hope for Palestine begin with this like massive destruction, massive carnage? Where do people, the Americans talk about going home? Where? What?
Okay, thank you, Susie.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Jehad?
I mean, it's really hard to predict the future when you are dealing with a present that is so painful, but at the same time is things are ever changing by the moment. We don't know if we're headed towards a regional war although we are almost in one. We don't know what the future of Gaza will look like. But at the same time, in the process of destroying one Gaza, Israel is creating many other Gazans or Gazas. Again, it's the impulse to think, the thinking that violence and violence alone can be used to suppress a nation's demands for liberation, for freedom, and for dignity. I can't really think of, like practical steps on what will happen in a month or two, but we have to grapple with the facts. And the facts show that most of the city of Gaza City, home to 700, 800,000 people, has been destroyed. No schools, no universities, no hospitals, no homes, no infrastructure. And I genuinely believe that the Israelis unleashed a plan that they had prepared for decades that aims to push Palestinians in Gaza to the Sinai so that they can get rid of Gaza once and for all. Gaza has been a problem for the Israelis for decades. And for now, Palestinians, despite all of the pain they have been enduring, all the killing and all the destruction, haven't pushed in the tens of thousands towards the Egyptian-Palestinian border and demanded to cross to the Sinai. And by the way, this scheme isn't new. I mean, the idea of resettling Palestinians in Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula emerged in the 1950s, and Palestinians in Gaza organized against it. And the language of opposing resettlement actually emerged out of Gaza in the mid-50s when Palestinian Islamist and communist members of the teacher unions organized together and challenged UN efforts then to explore possibilities for resettling Palestinians in Egypt. And in March 1955, there was an uprising that is not pretty well known in Palestinian history, but it's called the March 55 uprising, in which Palestinians in Gaza challenged the idea of resettlement and demanded that it's never put on the table again. And there were also many efforts by Israel after 67 and in the 70s to push Palestinians, to relocate them to the Sinai and to other parts of the world. And all of these attempts have failed. But with the scale and intensity of what's happening now, it's really hard to predict what's going to happen. I mean, people are starving. As I'm talking to you, we are hearing reports from northern Gaza of people at this point grinding the food, the animal feed, so that they can make dough and something that looks like bread that they could eat. People are dying of hunger and disease. So this is a bleak scenario, but at the same time, this moment invites or should inspire the need for a fundamental change with regards to how this issue is approached, especially by the United States. And if the US isn't willing to do it, they should make it an international, they should involve the international community in its entire capacity, because what we're dealing with is basically the product of the failures of decades of policies and directions and ideas and frameworks that led us here.
Thank you. Cole, I want to check in with you. It's 5 of. I'm thinking that maybe we present the 2 actions now, and then for people who would like to continue to engage with Jehad, that we could continue. As long, Jehad, are you willing to stay a little longer?
I can stay for 10 or 15 more minutes beyond 8 p.m.
Yeah, okay. Cole, what do you think?
Sounds good.
Okay, so Muhammad, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
And Cole or somebody, can you put the links in the chat for the action?
Yes, it will take me a
And-
minute to dig them, but I will do it.
Thank you. And Mohammed, do you want to start on one of the actions?
Yeah. Is that the first one is the rallies that we are planning?
Yes, after the
Uh,
ICJ ruling. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. So we are planning rallies at the offices of our Congress members the day after International Court of Justice ruling. I think it is Monday, yes, at 1 p.m. And so we demand that the Congress person, he or she, join the call for a ceasefire and an end to U.S. arms to Israel. I believe it's on January 29th and the various offices. And we like to invite you to attend those rallies at various Congress people's offices. That's the first action. Do you want to add anything, Abby, to that?
No, that's great, Mohammed. And the second one?
And the second one is that we are calling for a ceasefire. The action consists of sending a message to your member of Congress, asking them to support Congresswoman Cori Bush's ceasefire now resolution 681, which has been on table since October, and therefore oppose so the resolution support that your congressperson support that resolution, and also oppose the funding of Israeli war crimes with U.S. taxpayers' hard-earned dollars. Those are the 2 things that we have been asking: ceasefire resolution, and also an end to the provision of the arms to Israel. Abby, you want to add anything?
That was super, Mohammed. Thank you. And as everyone knows, we are eagerly awaiting the ICJ ruling tomorrow at 7 a.m. I think we're all going to be up watching that. So Jehad, maybe a few more questions. There's a question here. I don't know if you have an answer. Why didn't the UN act to stop the original Nakba in 1948?
The UN was a new body then, and it was still admitting members. I don't think the UN had the capacity, assuming the desire was there, to intervene in such a manner. But if we think about the United Nations, I mean, the United Nations represented or was controlled by the will of the victors of the Second World War. So I think this is very important in understanding what decisions were made in terms of the situation when it came to the situation in Palestine. But yeah, I mean, I'm not a UN expert, so I can't really fully dwell on this question.
Yeah, thank you. Julie?
Jihad, this is a big question, but what do you think of the feasibility of the two-state solution or a one-state solution or other solutions?
I don't know. I think uh, what this moment shows again is that the entire approach of the international community and especially the United States towards the Palestine question and the situation in Palestine and Israel has to be reconfigured. It's not a question of throwing a prepackaged answer and then anticipate things to improve. For me personally, growing up in Gaza, being familiar with the situation there, one of the things I tried to highlight in my writing and in my talks throughout the past 5 to 7 years, especially since I started writing about Gaza here in the United States, is to talk about what the situation in Gaza will look like in 30 years from now. And there were United Nations reports that projected that the population of Gaza was going to double by the year 2050, meaning that the Gaza Strip would become home to 4.4 million people. That's 4,400,000 people. That's the population will double. And the population density in Gaza now, the average population density is 6,000 per one square kilometer, or 13,000 in 1 square mile. So in 2050, we will end up with a population density rate of what, like 35,000 per 1 square mile. So I posed the question of what is being said in policymaking circles about the future of a place like Gaza that is home to this large number of people and is deprived of basic resources such as water, land, fuel. The Gaza Strip is a very small territory doesn't have much to offer. There's small areas of agricultural land, and that's about it. And of course, fishing. And there's Gaza's gas fields that Palestinians in Gaza don't have access to. But these are also, small gas fields. We still want them, but they're not going to make Gaza, like a Gulf state, right? So while Israel was justifying building and expanding settlements in the West Bank based on what Netanyahu called natural population growth, taking over Palestinian land in the West Bank, nobody was talking about what will happen to Gaza in 30 years when the population doubles. And so there are also practical considerations when it comes to thinking about the solution, right? So if we were talking about a two-state scenario, are we talking about a scenario in which Palestinians from Gaza would be allowed to live in the West Bank to relieve the population density of the Gaza Strip? Is this something that Israel would allow? But what we're seeing is the total opposite. Not only that there are no conversations, we're seeing one process that is well-funded, well-planned to establish Jewish sovereignty over the West Bank and expand and expand and expand, while at the same time, the short-term and long-term concerns and grievances and concrete issues and problems facing the Palestinian people aren't taken seriously. And more pressure is being exerted on Palestinians through occupation and settlement and checkpoints and siege and blockade and closure. And politically, we've seen the conquest of normalization, which complicated things further and brought about the explosion, the many explosions that we've seen in the past few months. And I'm talking here about the US drive to achieve US Saudi Israeli normalization before the election season, even if it would take the entire region towards a regional war. But that was the thinking of US policymakers in DC. I mean, we all heard Jake Sullivan a few days before October 7th talking about how the region is in most stable states like we've never seen it before. So there you go. I mean, these are the people who we're dealing with, so there is not a simple answer to the question of the solution. But I think before we delve into solutions, we need to assess the reality on the ground with honesty and courage and boldness. And maybe, just maybe, a new solution would emerge. But so long as we don't grapple with the reality on the ground and keep repeating the same prepackaged answers that we hear from Matthew Miller every time he speaks at the US State Department briefing, we might not die from bombs here, but we might die from boredom.
I'm laughing. Yes, it's terrible having to listen to Matthew Miller, and the things he says are so inane. Folks, we're sorry that we won't be able to take all your questions. I think we have time for one more, Jehad. And
Please.
yeah, and also I want to take a question that's asking about the Palestinians as opposed to asking Jehad to infer Israeli intention, if you don't mind. So I'm going to choose this question, which is, where do the Saudis and Egyptians stand in regards to the Palestinians? Are they providing any assistance to the Palestinians? You're laughing or you're smiling.
Well, I'd rather take the question.
You want the other one?
No, it's okay. I'm happy to answer this one. I mean, happy for. No, I think what we've seen in and a lot of Palestinian intellectuals and writers have been discussing this in conversations in Arabic and in the Arab media. One of the explanations of why we're in this moment now was that the US push for a Saudi Israeli normalization was seen by Palestinians as a dangerous sign, as something that would mark the end of the Palestine question, at least in its regional context where it's supposed to be secured. And there are many theories on why the United States was rushing this Saudi Israeli normalization. One interpretation was that the US wanted to shift focus onto China Pacific, didn't want to focus its capacities in the Middle East, but at the same time, the US wasn't planning to pivot out of the Middle East. This whole talk during the Obama era and after about whether the US wanted to pivot. No, the US did not want to pivot, but instead the US wanted to appoint as its new policeman in the region an alliance of Gulf states plus Israel, who would ensure that business is done as usual, the United States interests are preserved and maintained, and the rivals of the United States and its allies aren't allowed to, come into the region and undermine the United States and its allies. So that's basically one of the theories regarding the rapid push for a Saudi-Israeli normalization. And of course, domestic considerations in the United States. Biden wanted to go on the debate stage and tell Trump, hey, you did the Abraham Accords, I did the Abraham Accords ×2. That's Saudi Arabia, home of the holy sanctuaries of Islam. Now Israel feels so legitimized by the Saudis. etc., etc. The mistake that the American policymakers committed, though, was that they assumed that something on the scale of Saudi-Israeli normalization could be done through bypassing the Palestinians. And trust me, I talked to staffers on the Hill, and some of them told me, but the word was out that the Saudi-Israeli normalization would be great for the Palestinians. I told her the word, a completely different word was out in the Palestinian context, that it would be utterly harmful because you can't achieve an agreement on that scale with its symbolism and weight, with Saudi Arabia being home of the sanctuaries of Islam and the history and all of these things, and at the same time not address the Palestinian issue. So there was this sense amongst US policymakers that, you know, the Palestinian issue is not that relevant anymore, it's not that important anymore, that Palestinians could be bypassed and this alliance could emerge. So what this moment is doing now is that it's testing this alliance. At least, you know, we know that Saudi Arabia, even though Saudi Arabia hasn't fully normalized with Israel yet, we know where it stands. But at least officially, formally, now it's become much more difficult for the Saudis to come and embrace normalization. And this idea, this vision for how and what the region should look like from the standpoint of the United States, based on its current interests and foreign policy directions, is also being challenged now. And you know, Arab regimes in the beginning, they responded to pressures from below. We saw protests in Cairo, we saw protests in other Arab capitals, and Arab rulers were, you know, they showed sympathy with the Palestinians, but at the same time, unfortunately, since, you know, the rise of counter-revolution in the Arab world and the emergence of the tyrannical state in its most recent manifestations, it's become the levels of surveillance and the levels of crackdown on opposition and on free speech and the ability of Arab citizens, regardless of where they live, to organize and protest and challenge the policies of their governments, but also express sympathy with the Palestinian people. All of these things have become very, very challenging compared to previous moments, like, you know, in the early 2000s, for example. And Arab rulers know that because they understand that in the past, protests and organizing around Palestine have always created spaces for domestic opposition against these governments. And that's why this new cohort of tyrants in the Arab world understood the lessons of the Arab uprisings of 2010, 2011, and they are really gambling with not allowing for a room for expression around the Palestinian issue. We don't know how sustainable this is. I mean, we look at social media and we see the immense levels of sympathy from other citizens of surrounding Arab countries and across the Arab world and the Islamic world. But as I said, this is a watershed moment that is transformative and is going to redefine many of the rules that a lot of people took for granted, especially policymakers in this country.
Thank you, Jehad. You know, I just want to call out one comment here, which I wasn't aware of. Did you know that Haaretz reported today that they reached a 35-day ceasefire? Including
it's still in being negotiated. It's not.
Oh, I see. I see. Okay. So let's see. I'm just going to go back to this here. So Jehad, thank you so very much for this talk. I want you to be able to see everybody thanking you. You all, could you please give him a big round of applause? That was so terrific, Jehad. Thank you so much for joining us.
A pleasure.
wish-
Thank you so much.
We wish the best to you and your family. We hope they'll be safe in Gaza.
Thank
And we
you.
hope to see you on the other side of this terrible, terrible invasion and bombardment.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jehad.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Take care.